you can't afford to not know what your rights and responsibilities are under what you're agreeing to, because it's a legally binding document. You can be held in contempt of court if you don't do what you're ordered to do under that judgment, or if you do something that you're ordered not to do under that judgment. Welcome to the No Judgement Family Law Podcast. As we talked about last time, today we're going to be continuing from our first episode where we talked about Jason Sudeikis and Olivia Wilde's divorce. We're going to talk about Jason Sudeikis' probably most well-known character, perhaps, Ted Lasso, and some things that happened in the show where it was maybe questionable. Maybe we would have done it. We would have recommended he do it differently. As I mentioned last time, if you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave us comments. This is really meant to be an interactive podcast. We would like to hear from you, answer your questions, talk about some situations that have come up in your case. And so leave us some comments. If you like it, let us know. If you don't like what we're talking about, or you think that I'm crazy for what I'm suggesting, let me know. Wouldn't be the first time. But happy to discuss anything and everything related to family law. Like I said, this is going to be about all things family law. Nothing is really off limits except legal advice. I'm not going to be giving you legal advice, okay? Talk to your attorney about that. If you need an attorney, definitely go talk to an attorney. They will be able to help guide you. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about Ted Lasso and his fictional divorce case. So as many of you may know, in these, I'll give the spoiler alert disclaimer for anybody who's not watched Ted Lasso. But in the show, Ted Lasso, Ted is an American college football coach who gets recruited to go to England and coach a Premier League football, or soccer, as we call it here in America, team, and with no experience whatsoever. And so at the beginning of the show, we're left wondering, why is this happening? What's going on? But at the end of the first episode, we come to realize that Ted and his wife are separated. They have a child, a son, but they are separated. And so the first thing, I don't want to say the first thing, but kind of the first thing that we learn is that Ted has left his family in Kansas to go move to London and take this job in order to give his wife some space. This is about as much space as you could possibly give a spouse going across the globe. But that's something that a lot of people can empathize with. They can say, yeah, that's happened to me. My wife asked me to give her some space. And so my first thought was, okay, well, I need to move out. And in terms of needing to move out, that's not the case. Generally speaking, while it can be awkward, it can be uncomfortable, and depending on your situation, it may be appropriate to move out of the house. Generally, all other things being equal, that's not something that I would recommend to a client. I would not recommend moving out of the house, particularly if you have a child in the house. Your best case scenario, again, all other things being equal, is that you're going to be spending half of the time with your child. Now, in Ted's situation, obviously much less than half of the time. He was sort of, I'll say, relegated to a video phone conferencing type relationship with his son for significant periods of time. At some point, the child would be coming over and visiting and spending time with him over in London, but that's not something that you can do on, a week-on, week-off basis, which, ironically, that was what Jason Sudeikis and Olivia Wilde ultimately resulted in, was a week-on, week-off schedule. So that's the first thing that I would have advised him differently about was, if somebody comes in and they're not sure about whether or not they're getting a divorce, but they're looking at a period of separation, moving out of the house, generally speaking, would not be something that I would advise. Again, there are situations. If there's a domestic violence situation, if there's any sort of danger of staying in the house, those would be reasons why, yeah, absolutely, you want to get out of that house. You shouldn't be there. That's not appropriate to have that situation going on anymore. But generally speaking, staying in the house would be preferred. Now, at some point, somebody's going to file a court case. And in the show, Ted Lasso, he basically accepts service. He doesn't have an attorney. And so that, again, mistake number 2, not having an attorney. Thinking that you can do this on your own is problematic. Mostly because we use a lot of language as attorneys that sort of, it has special meaning when we use it. And so if we say something to what I will call a lay individual or a pro se litigant, somebody who's representing themselves, they might not fully understand what that means, what that term means, what the implications are of that term. And so that's something where, if somebody were to come up to me and say, oh yeah, we're going to take care of it ourselves, I would say, okay, well, what are the terms that you're talking about? Just 1, because I'm kind of nosy, but 2, because it's my job. And so, if it's somebody I know and I'm trying to look out for them, I want to know, okay, well, what are you guys talking about doing? And depending on what those terms are, maybe it's a fine deal. It could be a perfectly agreeable kitchen table divorce is what I call it. That's fine. But I think it's worth reviewing that with an attorney because, like I said, you may not understand what the differences are, or what your rights are, what your responsibilities are under that judgment. I had one time where a client, or I'll say a potential client, had come in for a consultation, and it was a modification of custody and child support that their ex-wife had filed. And he told me, well, I'm not really worried about the child support side because I let her keep the house and she waived child support. So she got the equity in the house. I don't have to pay child support. They offset one another. So I'm not really worried about that. And I looked at him and I said, well, do you understand that child support is always modifiable? That somebody can come back to court and say, well, I want to change the child support amount, but you cannot come back to court to modify the property division. And his jaw dropped to the floor. His attorney, or if he had an attorney at the time, I don't really recall, but his attorney had not told him that if he had an attorney. And if he didn't have an attorney, it's just something he didn't understand. And so knowing that, he probably would have made some different decisions in the original divorce case. That's one of those things where you just can't afford to not know what your rights and responsibilities are under what you're agreeing to, because it's a legally binding document. You can be held in contempt of court if you don't do what you're ordered to do under that judgment, or if you do something that you're ordered not to do under that judgment. So it's really important to have somebody there to explain what those documents mean and what it's going to look like going forward. But in going back to the show, in Ted Lasso, he was provided these documents by his wife. He, looked over them reluctantly, I'll say, signed them, although he ultimately accepted what was going on. Reluctantly, I think, he signed them, sent them back, and they were filed, and the case, for all intents and purposes, was over. But not life after divorce. And so that was sort of the next step. And this is where I think the show starts to turn the page in terms of how I would advise clients and things that I would recommend for clients to do, to things where I think they made some good decisions, where Ted Lasso was making some good decisions in terms of what to do, things to address, things that needed to be addressed. Again, this is one of those spoiler alerts. In the show, Ted Lasso, his character really starts to experience some mental health problems. He suffers from some anxiety attacks. And my belief, and what I believe the writers intended, was to sort of equate, or at least bring those two topics together, the anxiety attacks, and associate that with the difficulty that he was feeling with the custody situation that he had, the long distance custody that he was essentially forced into, maybe by his own doing, but forced into because he was living halfway across the world. And so he started having these anxiety attacks. And at first, he was doing what most people do, and that was deny, deflect, just try to push it away, try to handle it himself. And that was the wrong thing to do. And I think it shows that pretty clearly in the episodes as he progresses and as the attacks start to worsen to the point where, he has to leave the field because he's having an anxiety attack. But there's a turning point where the team hires a mental health professional who comes in and is helping some of the players with some of their issues. And ultimately, again, reluctantly, but ultimately, Ted goes and seeks that help. And you see the sort of transformation in terms of addressing some issues that were in his past and how those issues were affecting his ability to be a good father, be a good co-parent, be a good worker, to be a good coach, because it affects all areas of someone's life. And so the key takeaway for me from that was, acknowledging when there is a problem, particularly something like a mental health problem, where it can be difficult. It can be scary to go and seek that help. There historically has been a stigma placed around getting help for mental health conditions. But in my experience, what I've seen and what I think is probably most appropriate is proactively addressing those issues rather than allowing those issues to negatively impact your life without taking any sort of action for them. So it goes right in line with the theme of this podcast, which is no judgment. It's not my job to judge a client when they come in and they tell me, oh, I have this problem or I have this going on and I'm struggling with this. That's not my job. In fact, my job is actually to do the opposite, is not to judge them, but to help them figure out how we can address that and then go forward with it in terms of their case. Now, there might be issues where that's going to cause a problem with a certain custody schedule or a certain custody arrangement where there may be concerns that have to be addressed within the court documents. But it's something where, to me, the keystone that was in the show was getting that help. And once he got that help, he was able to sort of acknowledge those things, address those things, and then ultimately overcome those things. And so to me, that was one of those times where I was like, absolutely, this is something that, I can reference when I'm talking to other people about, look, I get it. It's scripted, okay? But it's scripted to sort of reflect real life circumstances. And so if that's an issue in your case, if that's something that you're struggling with, or maybe that the other side in your case is struggling with, that's something that is an option. And to me, I wouldn't even say an option. That's something that really needs to be addressed and taken care of within the context of that case. So as the show progresses and he is kind of realizing maybe some of the errors that he went through. And look, I think one of the things that draws people to that show is the relatability. Not necessarily the constantly positive attitude that he has. We all know people that are like that, but that doesn't apply to everyone. But I think the relatability of, look, people make mistakes. Things happen, right? You react certain ways just because there's high emotions involved in these types of scenarios. But when you have those things that happen, rather than denying that they happened, you have to acknowledge that and then address it and move forward, because you can't move forward unless you address it first. And so I think that's one of those things where, again, ultimately, Ted addresses some of those things and realizes that in order to be the best dad that he can be, even though he really enjoys what he's doing in his job, he needs to move back to Kansas. And so ultimately, that's where season 3 ended. Now, season 4, I don't know. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I've seen some of the things, it talks about, and I don't think this is really any sort of spoiler, but I've seen some of the commercials talking about there's going to be a women's team. I'm assuming that Ted is going to be coaching the women's team, which I'm also assuming he's going to be moving back to London. One of the things that I found interesting, and this may not be necessarily something that gives us another topic for a future podcast, but I would like to hear your theories about what you think is going to, what you think happened, not what's going to happen, but what you think happened at the end of season 3. Because my take was that they were not necessarily getting back together, Ted and his ex-wife, but that they were just co-parenting really well, that they got along, that they, work well with each other for their son. And that's really the ideal scenario. And to me, because I'll say the ideal realistic scenario, because generally speaking, it happens. Don't get me wrong. I've had cases where it happens, but it's unusual that somebody would get divorced and then they would remarry their ex-spouse. It happens. I'm sure there are many of you who could tell me, I did that, raise your hand. But it's unusual. So to me, the more realistic way to view it would be that, again, they did not get back together, but that they are co-parenting with one another in a very healthy way. And that's, again, what we would like to see. So there, I'm interested to see what's going to happen in season 4, to see if his ex-wife is going to move to London with him, with their son, if the son is going to play more of a role in the show, if he's going to be moving to London, maybe on his own, and mom stays in the U.S., though that seems pretty unlikely to me. But I'm really interested to see kind of what they do with that dynamic and how they address it and how they try to make it true to life. Because, when we look at these scripted shows, right, a lot of times it's easy to be like, well, yeah, that's Hollywood, right? Of course, it's scripted that way. That would never happen in real life. But the things that I saw in that show, they all seemed realistic in terms of things that I've seen people do before, or whether from a good perspective or a negative perspective. But it all seemed very realistic. And I think that's why the show was so successful, was that people could relate to a lot of the scenarios that were coming up in there. So if you can relate to some of those scenarios, or you've got some scenarios of your own, as we mentioned, we really want to hear from you. We really want your comments, because your comments are going to help drive this show and some of the topics that we talk about going forward. We are going to still relate some celebrity cases just because they're easy, right? They're easy for you guys to understand. You probably know more about them than, well, certainly you're going to know more about them than just the average person who you know nothing about. And they're a little bit inflated, right? Like we talked about, that 27,500 child support number. That's crazy, right? Like, I think most people would agree. What do you need $27,500 a month for children's expenses? But it's a different world. It's a world that a lot of us don't live in. And so, sometimes the law and logic don't necessarily match up. As lawyers, we understand that we have to follow the law. And sometimes what we think logically might happen is not the case, because the law doesn't provide for that, or the law doesn't afford that remedy. If somebody's been wronged, there may not be a remedy that the court has available. But those are some topics that we want to talk about. So like I said at the beginning of the episode, hit that like button, hit subscribe. And if you have comments, if you have cases that, situations where you thought, this is unusual, this is crazy, this is like nobody else has gone through this before. Like I said, I'll never say I've seen everything, but I've seen a whole lot. So anytime, anything, feel free to post about it. We're going to talk about all things family law with no judgment.